Well, it's the holiday season again. A time of the year when we should be thinking about giving, but for us video gamers, it's all about getting, as in getting new video games. Now, I got Final Fantasy IV Advance this year, but on this episode, I wanted to take you back to the early 90s, where a certain somebody got one of the greatest systems of all time, the Nintendo Game Boy. Growing up, my brother had the Sega Game Gear, while I had the Game Boy. It didn't really matter because we both played each other's systems, but even though the Game Gear had that bright screen and all those cool Sonic games, I still preferred the Game Boy. The battery life was amazing, all the accessories were great, and the games were fun. What more could you ask for? While the NES did bring Nintendo to the forefront of the industry, their most successful system of all time is still the Game Boy, selling over 118 million units. So, on this episode of The Game Historian, we're going to take a look at one of my favorite Christmas gifts of all time, the Nintendo Game Boy.
I guess you could say the Game Boy's life began with the Game & Watch, a series of handheld games created by Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi thought of the Game & Watch when he saw a businessman on a train playing with an LCD calculator. Each Game & Watch came with a single game and a digital clock on a small LCD screen, thus the name Game & Watch. From 1980 to 1991, Nintendo made a total of 60 different Game & Watch games. These little handhelds became very popular, and suddenly, the handheld video game market became a viable business in the gaming industry. Gunpei Yokoi decided to take the idea of Game & Watch a step further, and in 1989, his team at Nintendo came out with the Game Boy. It combined the portability of the Game & Watch with the graphics and interchangeable cartridges of the NES. Now let's take a closer look.
Now, as you can see, this is my original Game Boy, the same one I got for Christmas all those years ago. And it still has Pokemon stickers on it because Pokemon was awesome and easily one of the best games on the Game Boy. But I think we'll save that for another episode.
The system was simple to turn on, you just moved the switch on the top. The back of the system was where you put the cartridges and the 4 AA batteries. On the left side was the contrast slider, which was for the screen, and a power connector. If you had the Game Boy battery pack, you can plug it in and play without the need of batteries, which is sweet. On the right side was the volume slider and the link cable connector, where you could link up with a friend and play games like Tetris. On the bottom of the system was a headphone jack, a very underrated feature if you ask me. I can't believe it wasn't on the Game Boy Advance SP. As you can see on the front, the control layout is exactly the same as the NES controller, which was great because you didn't have to get used to a new control layout or anything.
So now we come to the biggest gripe of the Nintendo Game Boy, which is the LCD screen. It's pretty small and the color scheme is black and green. A lot of gamers wondered why Nintendo didn't go with a color screen like the Game Gear. For starters, using a color screen would make the system cost more money. Nintendo wanted the Game Boy to be affordable. Second, it would require more batteries. Not only that, but it would drain them much quicker. A good example is the Game Gear. It cost $50 more than the Game Boy, required 6 AA batteries, and only had about 5 hours of battery life. The Game Boy cost $100, required 4 AA batteries, and had about a 10 to 14 hour battery life. You know, this thing kind of reminds me of the Wii. The Wii is sold as a system that the whole family can enjoy. Well, back in the early 90s, the Game Boy was kind of marketed the same way, appealing to businessmen and fathers. And one big reason for this was the interesting game that was sold with the Game Boy.
In 1988, Minoru Arakawa, who ran Nintendo of America, saw a game at an arcade expo called Tetris. He became obsessed with the puzzle game and was convinced that this was the perfect game to package with the Game Boy. It was like bread and butter. Tetris was a huge success and was the perfect portable game to go with the Game Boy.
Video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
Nintendo shipped over 1 million Game Boys in 1989. By 1991, it seemed like everyone had a Game Boy. Hell, even President Bush had a Game Boy. Despite competing against systems with superior technology, the Game Boy creamed the competition with its simple design, awesome battery life, and great game selection.
The Game Boy ended up being the most successful system of all time for Nintendo, selling over 118 million units. It was also inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame in 2009. The Game Boy lives on today in its evolutions, but I will still never forget that wonderful Christmas day when I got my Game Boy. Well, that about wraps it up. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I've got a game I need to play. Have a happy new year, and I'll see you next time on The Gaming Historian.